Hey everybody, it's Jenna. I'm back with another breakdown of Peacemaker Season 2, and I'll just say that I've been particularly excited to get to this episode. I know I said that with last week's given the opening scene and the ramifications of everything in it, but this one is something special. In addition to just being a great episode of television, it started a few theories in my brain that I have been waiting for literal weeks to say out loud. So let's get started. Let's start with the opening scene, a flashback to Chris, Keith, and Augie hunting in the woods and stumbling upon the technology that leads to the quantum unfolding chamber. This scene is fascinating to me, especially when paired with some of the other things that we learn in this episode, which makes it even more fascinating that it wasn't supposed to be the opening for this episode. As James Gunn revealed during the official watch party for episode 2 on Threads, this scene was originally supposed to be the opening of episode 2, with the scene of Flag Sr. going through the files on Junior's death being the opening of episode 4. It was fun having the full context of that at the time, because I think these scenes work so perfectly with where they ended up. Sure, the scene with the doors could have packed a punch as the first thing we see immediately after Peacemaker 2's death, but it hits on a whole other level when Chris has now traveled between the universes multiple times and has now started to get involved with the lives of the people on Earth too. On the flip side, Senior learning the truth about his son's death and the audience even being reminded of it to begin with makes so much of 2 and 3 even stronger. I feel so bad for the little alien who Augie kills to get to the QUC technology. At first, in my notes, I furiously wrote down imp ? Only to realize that it probably wasn't. And the more I've thought about it, I stand by the point I made in episode 1's video about how we might not even see what they look like on screen for a while. I don't immediately recognize this alien from the comics, at least based on the information that we're given in this episode, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised if they're an entirely new character, especially when this specific kind of dimensional technology already doesn't really exist in the comics. Either way, the character design is so cute, which makes the death even sadder. The QUC is honestly sort of a Schrodinger's cat for me, since it didn't really originate from the comics, and it seems so fundamentally different from even the pocket universe that we got in Superman. I simultaneously do and don't want to know how it came to be. I've seen some people theorize that the doors will eventually evolve into being boom tube technology, but I don't think that's the case at all. Boom tubes function so differently, and they have a very unique thematic role in the Tom King and Mitch Garrett's book that's inspiring the Mr. Miracle animated series, which I'm really hoping will end up being DCU canon. But the framing device of using literal doors and the aesthetic of the space itself make me think that they had to have been made by somebody. I can't imagine that the alien from the opening scene created it, especially because every door we've seen is so much taller than they are. And again, a part of me loves the idea that it just exists and all of the narrative ambiguity that entails, but also a part of me is curious. And now that we're 4 episodes into the season, I can comfortably bring up my favorite part of Oh Lord being the theme song for season 2. It's not just that the dance number is such a joy to watch and that the lyrics are uniquely symbolizing the grass is always greener mentality of the entire season, it's that the opening notes of the song hit so well at the end of all of these opening scenes. The Do You Want to Taste It music cue was used in some fun ways in season 1, but it felt like one very specific kind of punctuation mark, triumphantly, facetiously, or otherwise, to end whatever scene was right before the opening credits. But so far this season, the opening notes of Oh Lord just stir up so much emotion. Euphoria, uncertainty, regret, pain, irony. It can be whatever punctuation mark you interpret it to be, while still having the prevailing emotion essentially be, oh shit. And I think that's great. The scene with Argus in the van is so good. I love how we've casually escalated from the weirdness of Flurry and Economos in episode 2 to the scenes in episode 3 to now having the entire group with Judo Master and Red St. Wild making things even weirder. So many lines in this scene make me laugh, a lot of which I can't repeat, but I do love Flurry's delivery of, if I was making a face, then that comes with having a face, and Sasha giving Ponyboy shit for finally saying something in the conversation. Also, this is the second week in a row that I get to bring up living in Chicago because Flurry lying that the wink is a Midwestern thing is so great. Both because it is not true, although it would be funny if we started making it true the same way we have with bird blindness, and because it harkens back to...
It's a regional dialect.
What region?
Upstate New York?
Upon rewatch, I found it funny just how nonchalantly Chris starts to realize that something has happened with Eagly while he was over on Earth too. The whole sequence until he leaves the house is such a great showcase of the quirks of his character, while existing completely outside of his relationships with other people or the emotional baggage he's currently dealing with. I quote his delivery of... way too often for that same exact reason. Also, I just love the detail of Chris feeding Eagly so much junk food, chips in season 1, and now bologna and all of the other things that Red St. Wild lists in the post-credit scene of this episode, while he's also being very particular about his own food choices. There's something very wholesome but almost sad about that when you view Chris's friendship with Eagly through the lens of him being emotionally stunted by the trauma he endured when he was a kid. Let's get into Red St. Wild and Eagly. I hinted at this a bit last week, but I've definitely come around to Rooker playing Red St. Wild instead of some existing character from the the comics because of just how ridiculous of a role he takes on. I know some people initially thought he'd be a sort of take on the Hunter, the Legion of Superheroes villain who took a very Kraven-esque approach to hunting down the team, but like with Flurry, his characterization and his gimmick and his commitment to the bit, including eating eagle poop, are so specific that I'd rather they just exist than being retrofitted onto an existing comic character. I also appreciate that the actual text of the show calls out the problematic parts of his gimmick with Economos' Captain Cultural Appropriation line. It also makes the reveal at the end of the episode that he can actually tap into ancient rituals and track eagerly even funnier, because we're not expecting it at all. Judo Master's fight choreography is even more over the top than it was in season 1, in a way that I really enjoy. These seemingly never-ending flips that he does to get to Peacemaker are great, and even the sound design as he moves through everything just lands so much more. I love an excuse to yap about the evolution of fight scenes in comics, especially when it comes to actual martial arts styles like judo. The early days of the medium had a combination of art and printing styles that could only be so detailed, and a bunch of white male creators who were only so familiar with the actual fighting styles. As a result, the words judo and karate and kung fu were thrown around quite a lot, but the commitment to showing the actual techniques of them varied wildly. I will forever love a quote that Denny O'Neil had about my favorite character, Black Canary, arguing, quote, "She did judo. Okay, I wonder if the people who made that up knew what judo was. She certainly wouldn't have worn those heels if she was in any judo class I've ever taken, but it's easy to take those kinds of cheap shots." That disconnect definitely got better over time, especially with the popularity of kung fu movies over in the West, while still being largely whitewashed. And some characters were introduced with devotions to very specific forms of martial arts. But in some cases, it became easier to say that a character was skilled in dozens of different forms of martial arts as a way for them to both hold their own next to people with literal superpowers, and for the actual choreography on the page to be whatever the artist needed to draw. Batman, for example, supposedly knows as many as 127 different martial arts forms, which is a little ridiculous. Judo Master has been an interesting case study within all of that. Some of his solo stories were faithful to the judo part of his name, to the point of having literal step-by-step instructions for moves that kids could use to defend themselves. But over time, and especially once he and the other Charlton characters were properly folded into the DC canon, he just kind of became another in a sea of martial artists. I feel like Peacemaker strikes a good balance between the two, leaning into the ridiculousness of it when necessary, but also having actual form behind it. I'm glad we get to spend so much time with Chris and Adebayo this week, now that their friendship has really solidified, but still hasn't been shown a lot since the season 1 finale. And I think the dialogue we get with them, even in the first scene of them driving to Settlers Hills, is illuminating in a lot of ways. After their whole conversation in episode 2, where Chris tried to downplay how weird his dad's stuff was growing up, we get hit with the actually weird trauma dump about using the QUC technology. Quote, "I think my dad was afraid it was dangerous, so he had me and Keith do it." Breaks my heart a little bit. We also finally address Chris hallucinating Augie in the last episode or so of season 1, which paid homage to Peacemaker hallucinating the ghost of his Nazi father in the comics. That plot point was introduced by writer Paul Kupperberg, whose name you will hear later in this video, as he worked to revamp Peacemaker in his move from Charlton to the DC universe in the 80s. It essentially turned Peacemaker's adventures into a very bizarre two-hander, where he either argued with or was being belittled by his ghost father as he mowed people down. There was also a whole thing in that era with him talking to his helmet, which he thought contained the souls of everyone that he ever killed, which I'm glad has not really made it on screen. Back when season 1 first premiered, I was delighted at the idea of maybe getting a new take on the problematic ghost dad storyline, but I had a feeling we'd pivot away from it once the multiverse angle of season 2 started to be revealed. And I think the way the show deals with it as a temporary trauma response that he told Adebayo about at some point between season 1 and season 2 works well. I'm also glad that this episode addresses the theory that Earth 2 is really just a figment of Chris's imagination, between him insisting that the dimension, quote, "isn't my mind playing tricks on me," and Adebayo suggesting that it still could be later in the episode. I still won't rule anything as being out of the realm of possibility with this show, and there is a fun narrative to be found with a dimensional door that's tailor-made to what a character subconsciously wants. But I feel like that could overcomplicate the way that pocket universes in the multiverse work within the DCU, and it would complicate a lot of what we've already seen and dealt with on Earth 2 so far. I don't think that Chris's subconscious dream logic would be able to create this exact world. I honestly feel like the way Earth 2 Keith and Augie have been with him goes beyond anything he could have imagined for himself, even at his most well-adjusted. The world also doesn't immediately include an Eagly and an Adebayo, two people that he would presumably want alongside him in a perfect world. Plus, there's the whiteness of everything. Again, nothing is impossible, but we get so many more interesting threads to pull just from the actual text of this episode. On that note, a theory that I've been wanting to tell you guys for literal weeks. When Adebayo asks who created the Peacemaker helmets in the QUC, given the fact that Augie is too dumb to, Chris simply says it's complicated. I feel like that answer could shake out in a number of different ways, but there's one possibility that I've grown particularly fond of. Ted Cord. Created by Steve Ditko in 1966's Captain Atom number 83, Ted Cord is the second man to take on the mantle of Blue Beetle, after he feels responsible for the death of the first Beetle, Golden Age adventurer Dan Garrett. Don't even get me started on Dan, and the fact that he exists either in DC or in the public domain, depending on how many T's are at the end of his name. Ted is a scientist and inventor with a family legacy at Cord Industries, a company that has ranged from a powerhouse in the DCU to a bought-out subsidiary of Wayne Enterprises. As Beetle, and without any sort of special superpowers, Ted takes the gimmick even further by creating a number of goofy gadgets and flying around in the Bug, a giant flying vehicle that is exactly what it sounds like. Outside of his solo adventures, he is easily best known for his tenure on what would become the Justice League International, sparking a hilarious and incredibly strong friendship, occasionally portrayed as more than a friendship, with Booster Gold. I love Ted in all of his goofy glory, whether he's on the JLI or cyber flirting with Barbara Gordon or just existing in the larger sandbox of DC heroes and villains. But in terms of getting adapted into live action, he was just a civilian on Smallville, and beyond that, he has definitely been among the always a bridesmaid, never a bride type of characters. You've maybe seen his gimmick on screen and not even realized it, between Watchmen and Ray Palmer in the Arrowverse, who was originally supposed to be Ted after years of teasing Cord Industries on screen. The Blue Beetle movie, which you should just go watch or rewatch if you haven't recently because it is just delightful, did a great job of honoring him and establishing his existing tenure as Blue Beetle without detracting from Jaime Reyes' origin story. Just like in the comics, this version of Ted could not get superpowers from the Beetle Scarab, but essentially devoted his life to studying it. At some point in that research, he disappeared without a trace, abandoning his daughter Jenny in the process, but the movie's post-credit scene hinted that he is very much alive. That brings me to Peacemaker in the QUC. Yes, Jaime and Peacemaker have a history of knowing each other in the comics, and people have wanted to see them cross paths basically ever since Cholo Mariduena was cast as Jaime. But the quotes around this season, particularly regarding Blue Beetle, have been telling. When asked about a Blue Beetle appearance this season, James has said,
"I won't say you're not in luck."
And one of the very first things Cholo said when asked if he's in this season is,
"There's a couple of Blue Beetles."
That has me increasingly convinced that we are going to see Ted in some way, who either ended up in Augie's clutches somehow, or whose research on the Scarab maybe triggered enough dimensional energy to lead him into a pocket universe or something else connected to the QUC. While there for an indeterminate amount of time, he was maybe then forced to design the different Peacemaker helmets, and maybe even the ones outside the door to Earth too, but that's a whole separate theory I'll get into later in this video. Ted does have a history of being manipulated into creating gadgets for bad guys. His entire origin story has to do with that exact problem, as his uncle tasks him with making an indestructible coating for his army of robots. None of this would counteract what we technically already know about Ted from Blue Beetle, especially when we're only told a limited version of the events from Jenny's point of view. Literally the only retcon I could think of when rewatching the movie through this lens was that the Oreos in the post-credits scene should probably be Chacos, which in the grand scheme of changes, especially the ones made this season, would be so small. This season has already pulled off some miracles in terms of threading the needle between different universes and corners of canon without ever detracting from the actual story at hand. And I would not rule out the possibility of Ted's arc from the Blue Beetle movie being folded into that as well. Sure, it would raise some questions, mainly where exactly is Ted stuck and why is he unable to get out, but it's clear from Chris's answer about it being complicated that there could be some strong ethical or moral or narrative reason behind that. And the fact that Ted's disappearance could so seamlessly be recontextualized into the world of this show would honestly be a feat, all while bringing another Charlton character into the fold of the show in a way that no one could have anticipated in 2022 or 2023, and all while explaining why we've heard so little about the Blue Beetle animated series that's been in development since the summer of 2024. I have one more small facet to this theory. About a month after the Blue Beetle animated series was first reported on by the trades, rumors started to swirl that Kumail Nanjiani has been cast as the DCU's Booster Gold. So many people have since taken this theory and ran with it, even as reports have indicated that he's not playing the role, and even as the creative team on the Booster Gold solo show has completely switched from Danny McBride to our Flag Means Death showrunner David Jenkins. While there can obviously be exceptions, DC Studios' attitude thus far has seemed to be that they won't cast major titular roles until a script is finished, which is why the persistence of this Kumail as Booster rumor has been so odd to me. But what wouldn't be odd would be already casting him as Ted Cord, with the plan for him to appear in supporting roles in some combination of Peacemaker Season 2, the Blue Beetle animated show, and Booster Gold. As someone who has been a fan of Kumail's for literal decades, I can see him embodying Ted so clearly, while still finding ways to really surprise us. His casting would also be pretty easy to retcon for the Blue Beetle movie, when the most we see of Ted is a borderline abstract family portrait painted by his dead wife. Again, it would explain the secrecy around the Blue Beetle animated show and why Kumail's name started surfacing around the early development of the Booster show, if both versions were being crafted to include him as Ted. I could be completely and totally wrong, and he could waltz into the season finale in costume as Booster, and I would still be delighted. but I have a hunch. Getting back to the rest of the episode, the arc of Economos continuing to fight back against Argus is so great. It's especially worth it to get to Flurry's reaction of him spitting in his eye. I also like learning the backstory that Economos hacked into the CIA and then was hired by them at the age of 14. He doesn't really have any backstory in the comics, with the closest thing being the fact that he was inspired by a real-life friend of Suicide Squad writer John Ostrander. So getting these little bits of history are nice. I cannot believe I cut my theory about Earth 2's Mr. Grant from last week's script, because I was worried that it was just a placeholder name and not worth several minutes of me yapping about Ted Grant. That is going to haunt me. So, in the essence of not doing that again, I'm going to share my train of thought on who Jeannie from Argus might be that Senior refers to. If that's not a placeholder name, I don't imagine that it would be the Joker's baby mama or Jean Loring, who is a complicated character in a multitude of ways. My dream would be for her to be Jeanette, who uses her Banshee abilities as a member of Checkmate, the Suicide Squad, and most importantly, the Secret Six. Created by Gail Simone and Nicholas Scott in 2009's Secret Six #3, Jeanette grew up around the 16th and 17th century as a reluctant ward of real-life serial killer Elizabeth Bathory, and was so horrified by what she saw under her that she lost her ability to speak. After slowly killing Bathory and failing to die at the hands of an executioner, Jeanette evolved into becoming a Banshee, and she resurfaced centuries later as the owner of a Las Vegas casino. I would love to see her on screen at some point, and I will hope for a Secret Six adaptation every single day, but I do have to admit that it would be fun if she was just already around at Argus. I love the Amelia stuff this episode, the fact that she sold her TV to make ends meet, but she has the 11th Street Kids photo from season 1 framed and hung up. The transition between this fight scene to the blood in the sink is so cool, and I hope we keep getting more weird teeth moments in this universe. But I particularly love the scene between Senior and Amelia. It hadn't occurred to me, despite the screen time that they've both had this season, that they hadn't actually interacted on screen yet. And I think this scene is a very interesting conversation that feels unique to the combination of the two of them. I've heard some complaints that Waller should still be the head of Argus in this show instead of Senior, and I think this scene shows on multiple levels why that wouldn't have hit the same. For one thing, it would have slowed down the momentum and the newness of this universe, as evidenced by the fact that Senior is set to return in Man of Tomorrow. But it also would have robbed us of what the show is able to say about Amanda Waller without ever showing her, that her tenure at Argus has not only created ethical dilemma upon ethical dilemma, but that she's created this powder keg of employees who are stuck in Argus's system, either because society has deemed them as supervillains or literal monsters or soldiers who aren't really capable of doing anything else, and they all have no choice but to attempt to eschew those labels and work through their very human emotions together. We've seen multiple beautiful found families rise out of that, but we've also seen a lot of pain, which both Senior and Amelia know on multiple levels. This whole scene is just a pendulum swinging back and forth between emotional intimacy and professionalism, and the messiness that can come out of those two extremes. They both clearly respect each other as good soldiers. Amelia has to actively force herself to call him Rick, and Senior literally flew across the country to be honest about her being blacklisted. And they also recognize that, directly because of Waller, they've both endured a lot of weird shit. I love how nonchalantly an alien invasion and Senior getting his back broken in a fight with Clayface and Frankenstein are brought up in this scene. It's a level of unabashed verisimilitude that I've wanted from live-action DC stuff for the longest time. And I love that Amelia's perspective has now shifted to Waller being at fault for Junior's death instead of Chris, down to her line towards the end of the episode about how, quote, I don't deserve this and neither does he. And even if she and Senior don't see completely eye to eye on everything, their shared pain has bonded them together on a weirdly personal level. He calls her kid, and she still remembers exactly how he takes his coffee. Even as Amelia was the, quote, other woman in her relationship with Junior, I totally buy that Senior would be aware of their relationship on some level and probably be more fond of her than of June. Probably because the idea of your son dating a literal sorceress could get messy, which also would make his exasperation towards Cersei and Creature Commandos funny in hindsight. There's just something really fascinating about that dynamic, especially when we've seen them both be messy and emotion forward so far this season. Every time I watch this scene, I am honestly floored when Amelia slips back into her season 1 hardcore cadence, talking about Agent Adebayo and Agent Smith and the events of the season 1 finale in a very clinical way, because it feels so out of place compared to the range of emotions that she's had so far this season and compared to the softer energy of Earth 2 Amelia. And by the time the scene builds to Senior asking Amelia to bring in Peacemaker, you recognize that it's probably one of the only logical conclusions of the scene, but you almost don't want it to. I didn't spot any Easter eggs in the magazine that Adebayo gets scammed into advertising for, but I do like that beat for what it illustrates about her earnestness while moving about the situation. Life has given her every reason to not be optimistic, and yet she's still finding ways to be. Also, Chris talking about the magazine confirms that Reddit is canon in the DCU. I wonder if that's one of the places that the monkey bots post to. Adebayo's delivery of Rick Flag Jr. is in love with you makes me laugh every single time, because I also love that some people walked away from their awkward interaction in episode 3, concluding that the Earth 2 versions of Chris and Junior might have history together. I love Chris's monologue where he suggests that maybe he and Peacemaker 2 ended up in the wrong universes, in part because it is such a heartbreaking distillation of where his mind and his self-worth are at, but also because it gives me an excuse to bring up another pet theory that I have. I mentioned this in my recent video on the multiverse, but one of my favorite multiversal stories of all time is on the TV show Fringe. If you haven't watched it yet, I'm going to dance around the specifics as much as humanly possible because I want you to be able to properly experience the emotional wallop of the plotline I'm about to describe. But basically, the show introduces a sort of Earth 2 in its second season and explores the ramifications of elements and often people being pulled from one dimension to another. This leads to some very fun Easter eggs in the show, including Earth 2 versions of iconic DC covers, but along the way, it's also revealed that a major character on the show who has been there since the beginning was actually born on Earth 2 and was brought over as a child after their Earth 1 counterpart died. I'm purposefully not even doing justice to how brilliantly that plotline hits in the show. Go watch it, trust me. This got me thinking about our Earth 1 and Earth 2, the similarities between the doorways and the shelves of Peacemaker helmets, and the potential problematic nature of both Augies. What if the two Augies were in cahoots somehow, and Earth 1 and Earth 2 Chris were swapped across universes as children, for some reason that we can't even begin to fathom yet? Did Peacemaker 2 find out about that at some point, and that's why he's addicted to the pills? And if Earth 1 Chris's instincts are right, and that really did happen, only for him to learn that his homeworld of Earth 2 isn't as perfect as it seems to be, how would that impact his mindset going forward? I don't believe this theory as strongly as I believe my Ted Kord theory from earlier, but I still need to say it out loud, because I think there's a version of that storyline that could be absolutely fascinating. I know we saw him disembody a corpse earlier this season without hesitation, but I love the specificity of Adrian bringing over doors from Lowe's without any questions asked. I really hope that we get to see Earth 2 Adrian at some point. I keep imagining him being this very gruff, no-nonsense, super serious version of himself, not unlike his usual characterization in the comics, which I just think would be so fun to see and so fun for Freddie Stroma to play. And finally, I teased it earlier in this video, but the setting for Chris and Amelia's meeting is Kupperberg Park, which is a reference to comic writer and editor Paul Kupperberg. His credits could honestly take up another 20 minutes of this video, but he had a very prolific career at DC in the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. This included a lengthy run on Vigilante, which helped reintroduce Peacemaker in those ways that I mentioned earlier, as well as Peacemaker's first solo miniseries at DC. He's also written a lot of prose work and ephemera tied to superhero comics, including the Atlas of the DC Universe, which has basically become a sacred text for me at this point. So many DC movies and shows have named streets or locations after comic creators over the years, including the street signs in Superman, but this reference feels uniquely fitting for this crop of characters, and especially because we haven't gotten one quite like it in the show's run so far. Overall, I think this episode is great. It clicks a lot of things into place while also raising almost as many questions as it starts to attempt to answer, without ever losing the emotional stakes between this ensemble of characters. I hate that we're already halfway through the season, but I have no doubt that the rest of it is only going to get wilder. What did you think of episode 4 of Peacemaker Season 2? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends if you haven't already done so. As always, you can find me on social media, especially on Threads, at Hey It's Jenna Lynn. Merch is available at the link in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, go read some comics.